Welcome to this week's rant, but before we start, the usual notifications. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please consider subscribing by hitting that subscribe button. If you want to be notified about when new content is added to the channel, hit the bell icon also. Consider supporting the channel on Patreon. That's www.patreon.com/TheMusicTechGuyUK. The address will be somewhere there, or maybe there. So this week's video is entitled Another Road Trip. And yes, they're back. So why did I go on a road trip? Well, I ended up in deepest, darkest Kent, and I ended up in deepest, darkest Kent to go and pick up this thing. So, for those who don't know what this is an S330 sampler. And the reason why we had to go on a road trip to go and pick it up was because the vendor would not send it by post. And the reason why he would not send it by post was because it comes with not one, not two, not three, but 4 of these disk storage units, which are pretty much full of disks from various disk libraries. And as you will know, I have a portions for collecting the discs from the disc libraries. So that's the reason why I went and bought it. In actual fact, as I said earlier on, I thought I'd lost it. I was actually watching the original listing for the unit and completely forgot that it was ending or was busy. I can't remember exactly what now. And the listing ended, and then the vendor relisted it at substantially less than the original listing, and I put in a normal cheeky bid as I normally do, and I won it. So I can't really complain about that because I got it for less than I was prepared to pay in the first place. But that's great. Anyway, as you know, I have already in the stable 2 Roland samplers. I have the S50 keyboard sampler, and I also have the S750 rack mount professional sampling unit. So kind of where does this sort of S330 fit into the story? So if we go all the way back to when this thing came out, and I can remember this thing coming out, and I'll tell you the reason why I can remember this thing coming out is because I went to see it being demoed. So it was introduced in 1987. And in 1987, I would have been sort of about 16, so it gives you some idea of how old I am now. And I can remember going to City Music in Harrow because I lived in northwest London at the time. And it must have been 1988 because I passed my driving test. I became 17 sort of between 87 and 88. And I passed my driving test quite quickly, and I actually drove over. It was one of the first places I drove, and I borrowed my dad's car. He was very trusting in those days, giving a 17-year-old his car to drive. But the story goes, I went to this place in Harrow called City Music, which was one of these places that was just dedicated to sort of synthesizers and electronic music, and it was sort of the whole sort of electronic scene was starting to explode, and computers and MIDI, and it was one of the places that I used to like to go to. City Music was one, and the other place I used to like to go was Project Music, which was in Hounslow. Both of which really sort of catered for the musician who was into the stuff that I now really into, but was into back then as well. But of course, this sort of 17-year-old who's driven over there to see the guy demo it could only dream of raising the £1,400 to buy one of these. In actual fact, I think the correct retail price was £1,384, but I seem to have in my head it was around £1,400. So let's stick with that, shall we? But in order to sort of work out where this fitted into the grand scheme of things, we sort of kind of have to go back to where Roland were with their samplers in the 80s. So earlier in the 80s, Roland had issued a sampling keyboard called the S10, which was kind of the forerunner. and for some reason it used quick disk format. And the problem with the quick disk format was it really wasn't becoming the industry standard. The industry was moving more towards sort of the 3.5-inch format, not the quick disk format. I know a number of computer manufacturers did use quick disk, like Spectrum, or is it Amstrad? It might be in the Amstrad version. They kind of use the quick disk format, but most of the industry was sort of heading down the 3.5-inch route at that point in time. Anyway, anyone who owns a sort of S10 is sort of kind of nowadays rather limited creatively, because if you use the keyboard to create stuff, and I do know somebody who actually has an S10, but if you use the keyboard to create stuff, you're kind of limited in terms of copying that stuff down onto a disk, because you can't get a hold of quick disks. They are absolutely like gold dust nowadays if you try to get hold of a quick disk. So it kind of limits the sort of S10. The S10 started out as a 10-bit sampler, or in fact, I say started out as a 10-bit sampler. It was a 10-bit sampler, it still is a 10-bit sampler. And as was the sort of follow-up rack mount unit, which was the MKS 100, which was the rack mount version of the keyboard. Again, quick disk format and 10-bit sampler. So Roland started off in this area here. In 1986, along comes the S50. Roland upped the game, move it up to a 12-bit format, and also move the disk drive on the unit up to a 3.5-inch disk, which was all well and good. And it was still only sort of double density, double-sided, but at least it was 3.5-inch. And a lot of the industry was around the double density at that point. High density hadn't really became a thing. And then along comes sort of about the same time the S550 sampler. And a lot of people will say that the S550 was the rack mount version of the S50. In fact, I would disagree with that statement. The reason why I disagree with that statement is because the S550 actually was an enhancement of the original S50, in terms of the S550 had double the sampling memory, and it also had real-time filters, which is something the S50 didn't have. So was it the rack mount version? No, it was actually an enhancement. Enter the 330. The S330 is also a 12-bit sampler. Okay, so it's exactly the same, works on the same sampling algorithm as both the S50 and the S550. It only has the same amount of memory as the S50 for sampling, but it has the real-time filters that were on the S550. So kind of the S330 sat somewhere between the S50 and the S550 in terms of feature set and function. Were the advantages over the S550 or the S330? Well, the S550 had more buttons on the front. You could do more control from the front of the machine itself. Whereas, as you've seen when I held this up a couple of minutes ago, this was only a 1U unit, so you couldn't get as many buttons on it. And to be brutally honest, if you wanted to use the S330 to its fullest, you had to have the RC100 remote control for it, and you obviously needed a monitor because you needed to understand what was going on in the unit itself. In fact, I've actually found out with all the Roland series samplers, you can do an amount of things from the front panels, but really to get the best out of these samplers, you really do need a monitor, a third-party monitor there, to be able to understand what the sampler is doing. But I'm quite lucky because I do have, it's in storage unfortunately at the moment, but I do have the the RC100 unit. I have that. It's in storage. It's a bit of a bummer at the moment, but it's it's there. I can go down and get it. I'm just not quite sure when I can go and get it at the moment. And I've also got the RGB cable for the samplers, the Roland samplers, which is, of course, a different RGB cable to anyone else who was using RGB at that point in time, because I've found out that my CX5M, which is the Yamaha computer, uses a completely different format. I've got another couple of pieces of equipment that have RGB outputs, and guess what? They are completely different formats as well. And you have to be very careful with the RGB outputs, because if you use the wrong RGB format, on a piece of equipment, you can end up blowing the internals of the piece of equipment if it's not correctly protected. So the next thing is to see how it performs. So I will be plugging it in over the next week, hopefully, and then we will find out how this thing performs in situ. And the next thing, the second part of the title, and they're back. I'm not sure whether I've mentioned maybe once or twice that Genesis are quite a big influence on my musical stance. Is an influence. I used to live a hop, skip, and a jump from Fisher Farm Studios at one point. I've been there. I believe it's still open. I think Phil Collins sold his shares to Mike and Tony, but I believe it's still owned by Mike and Tony. In fact, I saw somebody on YouTube not that long ago actually using the studio because Mike had given permission. So I'm pretty sure they still own it. That's kind of irrelevant trivia, really. But the big news this week was that Genesis, Monday, Tuesday this week, announced that they were going back on tour. The rumours have come true. They've gone back. They've said they're going back on tour. They released tickets on Friday. So I spent probably about 2 hours on Friday morning on the telephone and on the internet trying to get tickets, and I have succeeded. I am absolutely over the moon. I have succeeded. Not only have I succeeded to get tickets, I've managed to get centre block, first block from the stage, 4 rows back from the stage. Talk about ecstatic. It doesn't even describe this. I have seen these guys ever since I was old enough to go and see them. Every tour I have seen them. I am ecstatic to go and see them on this tour. It's probably going to be the last time that Genesis tour, if we're brutally honest, unless they sort of decide they've got the bug and they want to go back out on the road. And many sort of these sort of groups of this area are now back on the road, and they're doing 10, 12 gigs a year. And I've been seeing a lot of these groups over the last couple of years for one reason or another. I mean, I always wanted to see Hall & Oates. I've seen Hall & Oates twice now. I always wanted to see Jeff Lynne and ELO because I missed them the first time round. I was too young. I've seen Jeff Lynne, numerous times now. But seeing these guys again just leaves me with utter chills because they were such a big influence. And I'm kind of hoping they're going to go back in the studio and put some more material down. And if they do go back in the studio and put more material down, I will be absolutely ecstatic because I think the way they write and the way the material comes together is fab. I thought it for a long time. People was criticised, and they sort of kind of say that Genesis went through 3 phases, effectively. The early stuff with Peter Gabriel, the mid stuff when Gabriel left, up until probably around about Invisible Touch, or just before Invisible Touch, and the albums in that section are probably my favourite as well. And then you've got sort of Invisible Touch and We Can't Dance, which were considered more commercial, although I think their writing styles have just changed. But I love I've said this before, Then There Were Three is my favourite album of Genesis. So I'm going to leave this week on a high and say, whoopee! Until next time, bye-bye.